Hello everyone. Today's movie is based on the true story of a troubled teenager who starts with petty thefts and minor offenses, but as the story unfolds, he dives deeper into the criminal world. This path eventually lands James, the main character, in a high-security prison. There, he begins a profound transformation, redefining both himself and his view of the world. The movie begins with a scene where the protagonist finds himself behind bars. A prison guard firmly presses the teen to the ground with his knee, attempting to intimidate him. However, James stubbornly refuses to answer the guard's questions.
Oh man, this is gonna be fun.
As a result, James receives a couple of hefty whacks with a sturdy baton before joining the rest of the inmates. There, one of the men tells him that picking a fight right after stepping off the prison bus isn't the best way to start getting acquainted with his fellow cellmates. The name Burns echoes through the cell block, and an officer appears at the entrance of the cell. He calls for James and escorts him away. The protagonist heads to the shower, letting the water flow over him for a few minutes, when suddenly a surge of rage engulfs him. The next scene revisits the events from 3 years earlier. James is brought to a new school by his mother. Tired of being an outcast and believing he won't fit in again, James wears an ankle monitor designed to track the movements of people with a criminal record. The admissions committee is hesitant to accept James into the school, arguing that their institution might not be the right place for a guy with such a record. Tracy, his mother, argues that as a public school, it should be open to everyone.
James already has convictions for robbery, vandalism, and assault.
Over the span of 8 years, James found himself in trouble with the law 3 times, each incident impacting his ability to secure school enrollment. After leaving the school, James retreats to his room where he writes his thoughts in a notebook while listening to music. Suddenly, Tracy appears and sits on the bed beside him, attempting to comfort him. The following day, he spends the entire time lounging on the sofa in front of the TV. In the evening, he ventures into the kitchen only to discover they've run out of milk. Despite hesitating because of the ankle monitor strapped to his leg, he eventually decides to head to the store. There, he encounters 2 individuals, dark-skinned Manny and his friend Crystal. The pair distracts the store clerk, steals some groceries, and swiftly exits onto the street. As they leave, they slip some of the stolen items into James's hands. At that moment, the store clerk emerges from the restroom. Reacting quickly, James slams a carton of milk onto the clerk's head and dashes off to catch up with his new acquaintances. The 3 of them start to bond as they walk a few city blocks together. Suddenly, James announces that he needs to head home because his ankle monitor will activate at 8 p.m. He also shares with the young delinquents the reason for the authorities' surveillance. He had brought a gun home.
My mom found in my sock drawer and free, so I got 15 months in jail.
Tracy decided to call the police, seemingly to teach her son a lesson. After sharing his side of the story and enduring some teasing from his new friends, James tries to head back home. However, Crystal stops him, suggesting they meet up the next day, which James accepts. The next scene takes us to the prison yard where inmates are milling around. When a newcomer arrives, Guillermo, the local gang leader, and his followers take notice and challenge the newcomer to prove his loyalty to them. James intervenes, accusing Guillermo of bullying minors. In response, Guillermo tells him to go to hell, prompting the guards to start communicating on their radios and preparing their weapons. Guillermo attempts to punch James but is quickly hit by a rubber bullet. The guards then order all the inmates to lie face down on the ground. A prison officer helps James up and remarks that he has been incarcerated for just 3 weeks, but has already been involved in multiple fights. Chris, the newcomer James was defending, steps forward to support him. The guard taunts James, calling him a failure, and warns him that such behavior won't earn him parole. The next flashback takes us back to the protagonist's friends. Together with Manny and Crystal, James visits his new acquaintance, Mary. Finding Mary's place empty, the teenagers decide to hang out there. Crystal heads to the minibar and begins to steadily empty it. As the table becomes cluttered with stacks of small empty bottles, she decides it's time to dance. She pulls James, who had been sitting for a while, to his feet, turns on the music, and they begin to dance in a manner that resembles a mating ritual. Later, as they walk down the street, James's newfound friends inform him about Rock, a gangster who sets up jobs for them. Afterward, the group heads back home. In the evening, Tracy discovers a stash of empty liquor bottles hidden in her son's pillowcase. Anxious, she confronts James, reminding him that at any moment, the parole officer might pay a surprise visit and send him back to prison. James confesses that he does not want to return to school. In the 2 months since his release, he has felt continually rejected by society. He is tired of having to beg and humble himself before the system. He then accuses his mother of causing his father to abandon the family. In response, Tracy retreats to her room, leaving James with his younger sister Holly, who is watching TV. Tracy tells him that he is free to make his own choices in life, even if it means letting everything slip away. That night, the teenager goes to his room and removes his ankle monitor. Back in prison, James, Guillermo, the newcomer Chris, and 3 other inmates are in the shower. Guillermo quietly converses with a fellow inmate, receives a shiv from him, and then stealthily approaches James from behind.
James, watch out!
Chris gives James a last-minute warning, and James knocks the shiv out of Guillermo's hand. A scuffle breaks out, during which the new guy is stabbed in the stomach. The prison guards are in no rush to break up the fight. They let the inmates tire themselves out for 5 minutes. Only after that do the officers enter the shower room and force everyone to lie face down on the floor. An injured but still alive Chris is taken to the doctor. Meanwhile, James is taken for questioning by the head warden. He's taken to the hospital, but he's not allowed to speak to the warden. The warden attempts to get James to reveal who had the shiv, emphasizing that Chris is in critical condition after being stabbed twice. It also turns out that this is his first offense, and he's in for car robbery. However, James doesn't budge. He refuses to snitch on Guillermo or his henchmen. The warden then tells James that he is aware of his past. According to the records, the juvenile delinquent managed to get away from the crime scene, but his girlfriend turned him in. If it wasn't for her, he'd be free. Her testimony took up a whopping 12 pages. In response, James tells the warden to go to hell, resulting in his immediate transfer to solitary confinement. While James is serving a penalty for the brawl, another flashback kicks in. James arrives at Rock's place. Outside, a guard pats him down but eventually lets him in. In the room, the gang leader is engrossed in a video game and beckons Crystal over to ask her about the visitor. James states that he wants to earn some cash. Crystal comes down the stairs in her underwear and tells Rock that she barely knows James. Rock tries to shoo the guy away, explaining that he doesn't work with minors. James persists and refuses to leave the room. At this point, Rock grabs a gun and approaches James up close. The teenager reassures Rock that he's not seeking any favors and is willing to do whatever he's asked. Rock decides to test if James can be easily intimidated.
Woof. Woof.
Rock offers James a job as an errand boy, and James readily accepts. James calls his mom and explains that he won't be coming back home. Tracy attempts to persuade him to reconsider, but he bids her goodbye, sends his best wishes to Holly, and hangs up. His future partners in crime await him in the distance. The gang heads to the location, with James behind the wheel. Once there, he requests to join the showdown, but Rock declines. James has to sit in the car with the engine running. Rock mentions that he and his crew will be back in 10 minutes or less. The trio breaks into the house, and James watches them from the car. After some time, he spots a shadowy figure approaching the house where his accomplices have entered. Silently, James sneaks into the building and heads up to the second floor. There, he finds his entire crew on their knees, held at gunpoint by 2 armed men. Swiftly, James grabs a frying pan and knocks out one of the intruders, then disarms the other with a quick move. Seizing the opportunity, Rock shoots the disarmed man's leg with his shotgun. James grabs a bag of loot, and the 3 of them make their exit. In the car, Rock tells James that things just got real for him. The associates then drive to a strip club, where James receives half of Manny's share for his bravery. Back at Rock's house, Crystal takes a seat beside James and playfully flirts with him. James confesses that he called his mom earlier to let her know he wouldn't be coming back home. Crystal slips an unfamiliar pill into his mouth and plants a passionate kiss on him. While they share this intimate moment, Crystal exchanges glances with Rock, who's engaged in conversation with a provocatively dressed lady nearby. Rock looks back at Crystal. Afterwards, James invites Crystal to join him for a dance, to which she eagerly agrees. As the night progresses, the two end up in bed together, and Crystal lets James stay over at her place, which is on the 2nd floor of Rock's house. The flashback ends, and we return to the prison scene. James is released from solitary confinement and brought back to his cell. During the night, he has a nightmare about the shower room incident. He rises from his bunk, grabs a mirror, and extends it through the cell bars, attempting to strike up a conversation with his neighboring inmate. The man responds dismissively, stating he has no interest in making friends with someone who has been recently jailed. James insists he has spent 3 years in jail, but receives no response. Out in the yard, his friends tell him that Guillermo is hatching a new revenge plan. James isn't bothered by this. His attention is fixated on a quiet neighbor, a man seated on a bench, engrossed in a book. James wonders why nobody bothers this particular prisoner.
Motherfucker's got status on the yard.
Killed 5 people to land inside and say he's done 2 more since.
As everyone is ushered back inside, James stands behind the guy from the cell next to his. He notices a Rio de Janeiro city guide in the prisoner's hands and teasingly asks if he's thinking about taking a vacation there. The fellow inmate, whose name happens to be Conrad, gruffly tells James not to speak to him. The day after their yard walk, James tries once more to strike up a conversation with Conrad. He knocks on the wall, tossing out a question about Rio, but receives no reply. As another night rolls by, the prisoners are let out again for their walk in the yard. James decides to distance himself from his buddies and approaches the silent man. Finally, Conrad opens up, revealing a deep desire to one day visit Rio de Janeiro. James asks him for advice on how to handle Guillermo. Conrad cautions him against getting into a brawl in the yard, as it's a surefire way to remain behind bars indefinitely. The walk ends, and James returns to his cell, where he contemplates picking up paper and pen to write, but his urge to engage in literary pursuits quickly fades. We're taken back in time to just a day after the robbery. The gang casually strolls into a small supermarket, causing a bit of chaos. James heads over to purchase a pack of cigarettes, while Crystal discreetly steals a bottle of liquor. When the cashier requests his ID, it becomes evident that James doesn't have one. Initially hesitant, she eventually hands him the pack. As the teenager is about to pay, the cashier refuses to accept his money, mentioning that she's heard about his neighborhood exploits and run-ins with gangsters, and she'd rather avoid any trouble. At that moment, Crystal approaches the counter and leads James away. The young thug cruises around town in a classic car with Crystal by his side. He's a real risk-taker, swerving into oncoming traffic and blowing through red lights. Initially, Crystal finds it amusing, but eventually, she puts her foot down, tells her boyfriend to pull over, and scolds him for his recklessness. It turns out there are illegal goods stashed in the trunk. If they caught the attention of the cops, they would have been looking at a 10-year sentence each. But James just grins slyly in response. At night, Rock, James, and a couple of other gangsters hang out at a strip club. The gang leader talks about the criminal talents and loyalty of his new protege, James. Later, James and Rock sit alone at the bar. Rock promises him great success in the future and congratulates James on his newfound romance with Crystal. He comments on the presence of frivolous women out there. Suddenly, James's expression changes as he looks at the dance floor and notices Crystal dancing with a stranger. The flashback ends, and James strolls down the prison hallways with the warden by his side. Today, he has a visitor, his mom. Tracy talks to her son, tells him about his sister, and promises him a genuine Christmas celebration. James remains noticeably indifferent, causing his mother's eyes to well up with tears. She confesses her dislike for correctional facilities and shoulders some of the blame for James being there. Once the lights are out, James can't fall asleep. He gets out of his bunk, grabs a pencil and some paper, and begins to write. Even during his next yard walk, he takes along a notebook and a pencil, distancing himself from the rest. One day, James discreetly approaches his neighbor inmate, passing over a handwritten note. The man reads it attentively, then raises an eyebrow, questioning why James cares about his opinion. In response, James asks if the rumor about the man killing 5 guys is true. The inmate stands and begins talking wistfully about the statue of Jesus Christ in Rio de Janeiro. Eventually, he advises James to keep writing, emphasizing that it doesn't matter how good he is at it. The key is to distance oneself from one's surroundings. The teenager follows his advice and spends his nights writing poems about his imprisonment. The next day, the inmates are out for a walk again. Chris, who has recovered from the stomach wound, also shows up in the yard. He sits quietly against the wall. James decides to approach him and advises Chris to stand up and not show any weakness. In response, Chris hands him a letter from his girlfriend. In the letter, she reveals her decision to break up with him. James tells Chris that he's going through a similar situation. Chris plans to report the shower incident to the administration, bypassing the wardens, hoping it will make a difference. James convinces him not to do it, suggesting he should lay low until he gets out soon. James reassures Chris and tells him not to dwell on the breakup.
All right, once you're out of here, you'll get a new girlfriend.
This marks the start of another flashback. In the evening, James meets Manny at a nightclub. Together, they sneak into one of the club's back offices. Inside, they find the owner having a great time. He is taken aback by whoever dared to interrupt his fun and pulls out a revolver. He places his gun in front of him and states that he will only work with Rock, not his errand boy. James then aims the gun at him and tells Manny to pick up a second firearm from the table. Rock's protege attempts to persuade the club owner to hand over the cash. In response, he is told that there is no money here. In frustration, James fires a shot at the lamp beside the man. Just then, security guards storm into the room, disarm the guy, and give them a couple of hefty punches. Afterwards, James steps outside and uses a metal pipe to shatter the rear window of a nearby SUV. Inside the vehicle's back seat, he finds a bag with firearms and other items. The protagonist takes the bag and heads over to Crystal's house. She criticizes him for his hasty and aggressive actions, believing he should have left the room when he first saw the revolver. She then labels James as someone who is recklessly toying with danger. The young gangster becomes irate and starts accusing her of being involved with Rock and others. Finally, he insults Crystal by calling her promiscuous before storming outside. James arrives at the nearest store, where he's greeted by the salesgirl who had given him cigarettes earlier. James rudely orders her to unlock the beer cooler. She silently complies. After a moment, James comes to his senses and apologizes for his outburst. They spend the evening right there on the store's floor, sitting and leaning against the refrigerator, chatting. The girl, named Sarah, explains that the store is owned by her dad and she helps out after school. She has to work night shifts because her dad developed a drinking problem. Then she admits she's scared of James and offers him a smoke, which he accepts. Sarah tosses out a question about Crystal, but James evades the question. Later, James heads to Rock's place. Rock is displeased with his protege's actions and accuses him of botching a crucial deal with the club owner. In a fit of anger, Rock pushes James against the wall and threatens him with a gun, berating him for acting recklessly and for stealing a stash of illegal firearms and bringing them home. Rock is furious and orders James to figure out what to do with the stolen items before the police catch them all.
You and D are gonna figure out a way to fix this.
A new scene begins in the interrogation room. James asks the head warden to remove Chris from the yard until his hearing, which is imminent. James believes the inexperienced Chris is in danger because of the shower incident. The warden refuses to assign Chris a guard and suggests that James inform on the inmates who might pose a threat to Chris. The team disagrees and accuses the warden of neglecting the situation. The warden becomes irate and refuses to assist James in any way. During one of their walks, Guillermo confronts James for meeting with the prison administration and even tries to provoke James into a fight, but James opts to walk away. The story then flashes back. Rock's henchman takes James to Crystal's place, but instead of entering, James decides to stop by the store where he meets Sarah. They decide to go for a walk. During their conversation, Sarah opens up about her family, and James appreciates her honesty. He also talks about his troubled past, revealing that he has been arrested multiple times since he was 6 for various minor offenses like fights and vandalism. James admits that he's tired of being judged and just wants to live a normal life. Soon afterward, James tells her that he thinks Sarah is attractive. She invites him to her place, where they hang out watching TV and drinking juice in a relaxed atmosphere. Sarah rests her head on his shoulder, and he hugs her. Meanwhile, Crystal is with Rock. The scene shifts to the penitentiary, where Chris sits in front of a panel, facing an additional 6-year sentence after his case is reviewed. He was nearly finished with his 2-year sentence, but the altercation in the shower has jeopardized his chances. We return to the past again. James waits for his new girlfriend and her friends after school. A guy invites him for a game of basketball. James keeps scoring, then confesses to Sarah how he perfected his basketball skills during his time in prison. Sarah responds with a friendly peck on the cheek. As their relationship progresses, they spend increasingly more time together. James makes a commitment to take his sweetheart away from their troubled neighborhood. Sarah is touched by this promise. After another sweet date, James decides to move out of Crystal's place and packs up all his stuff. It turns out he hasn't shown up at Rock's for 2 weeks. Crystal, feeling jealous, tells James about how much fun she had last night with Rock, but James doesn't listen to her and leaves. Outside, he is met by Rock and his accomplice Drew. They inform him that they've found a buyer for the bag he stole. Now, James must close the deal to set things right. The deal is scheduled for the same day. Rock tries to reproach his protege for his lack of loyalty, but James retorts that he owes him nothing. The thug tries to convince the teenager that he will have a great future if he stays in the gang. James decides to pull one last job with Rock. The story continues in the prison. During a morning roll call, Chris puts a noose made of bed sheets around his neck and steps over the fence. James pushes through the guards and tries to reach his friend. No! James shoots an angry glare at Guillermo. The head warden admits that the situation wasn't supposed to happen, but insists that what's done is done. Enraged, James charges at his foe, knocking him down and landing a series of punches on his face. He is subsequently placed in solitary confinement. James's neighboring inmate witnesses the fight, becomes upset, and walks away. In another flashback, James and Drew wait for the client. A group of tough-looking guys shows up, and after a tense negotiation, a shootout erupts. Amidst the chaos, Drew and his partner manage to retrieve their stolen goods and flee, just as the police arrive at the scene. The police also show up at Rock's place and detain both Rock and Crystal. James sees them as they're being taken into a patrol car. He rushes to Sarah, suggesting they leave town together, but she declines. James confesses to her that she's the only reason he wants to turn his life around, then leaves, feeling frustrated. Next, the storyline shifts back to the prison. The head warden is summoned by a review board to discuss James's parole. The board notes that James has been incarcerated for 4 months, and during this time, he has been involved in numerous altercations and troublemaking incidents. The head warden anxiously listens but refrains from offering any positive remarks about the teenager. Out in the prison yard, James plays ball with another inmate when they get into a fight. Conrad steps in, warning the aggressive inmate and even threatening him. He then advises James to behave as his parole hearing is approaching. However, James responds rudely, questioning why Conrad cares, considering he's serving a life sentence. This response leaves Conrad infuriated. He screams that he would give anything for a shot at a regular life, but eventually lets James go. The next scene takes us to the committee hearing. James shares a heartfelt account of the impact Chris's death had on him. He sincerely apologizes and requests an opportunity for redemption. To everyone's surprise, the committee grants him parole. James changes into ordinary clothes and reunites with his mother and sister. At the same time, we see a flashback of James being arrested. At the police station, he locks eyes with Crystal. After his release, James takes a nighttime job at a grocery store, mainly tasked with cleaning restrooms as he tries to find his place in society. One fateful night, members of his former gang approach him. Luring him back into his previous lifestyle, James succumbs to temptation and, while trying to stash the illegal goods, stumbles upon an empty cigarette pack that Sarah had once given him. He wants to find her, but her father's store is closed and she no longer lives at her previous address. James finds Sarah's new address and meets her. Sarah is engaged but is happy to see her old friend. James harbors no hard feelings. He tells Sarah that he began to write poetry in prison and then expresses his frustration that everything in this town seems intent on pulling him back into a life of crime. Sarah convinces him to recite his poem to her. As the voiceover recites his poetry about the criminal life, James returns the illegal goods to the seller, continues with his regular job, moves out of his mom's place, and starts a new life. Over time, James saves up enough money to start living in New York City. The epilogue states that James gets his life back on track. He settles in New York and pursues higher education. What do you think? Is the movie worth seeing or not? Leave your answer in the comments and subscribe so you don't miss the summary of your favorite films.